So, Joseph. One of my favorite stories in the entire Bible. So much good stuff in his long arc. And we get kind of the end of it here today. But does anyone remember what Joseph's brothers did to him?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They threw him in a pit.
They threw him in a pit.
And sold him into slavery.
And sold him into slavery. Threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery. And what he went through after that, oh my goodness, because he was sold. He ended up being bought by one wealthy leader in Egypt, then falsely accused. He's cast back into prison. And eventually, he gets pulled out because, why?
He can interpret dreams.
He can interpret dreams. And he interprets one of Pharaoh's dreams, and from that, they're able to know that there will be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and Joseph gets put in charge of making sure that they save up, so they won't starve. Now, fast forward to this moment where we see Joseph forgiving his brothers. They've come because they want food, right? They've heard Egypt has food where they live. Not so much because they didn't have Joseph to help them plan. And the part that we skip is when they first show up, because they do not recognize him. They do not recognize him at all. It's not what they expected. I can imagine that they've thought about him a lot. It must weigh on them what they did. I would hope that they regret what they did, but they weren't expecting to see him serving next to Pharaoh. And what I just can't even begin to imagine is what it took for Joseph to be able to forgive his brothers. I mean, what do you think went through his mind when he first saw them? He's probably nursed ideas of retribution and the moment to make them real for a long, long time. And he does indulge that impulse a little bit. He's not about to let them just go scot-free.
No, he plays with them.
He plays with them, you're right. He pulls different games, he wields his power a bit. I'll help you, but first you got to go back and get your father. You got to leave your youngest brother here. Oh, you come back. Oh, here we are. Oh, now I'm going to throw something in your backpack and frame you for stealing it, just so I can get you worried about imprisoning your father's, new favorite younger child. It's a fun story, and I feel a little sense of ooh, good for him, go for it, because he's kind of holding them to task for what they did. He's letting them feel it. But at the end of all of this, what we get today is this extravagant act of forgiveness that brings about reconciliation between Joseph and his family. And it changes everything, because without that extravagant act of forgiveness, Joseph's family probably would have starved. And I think Joseph would have died alone. No future for either of them. But the reconciliation gave them future together, from death to life. So, we think loving your enemies has never been more difficult than it is now. I know, I feel that way. But honestly, if you think about it, it has never been an easy ask on Jesus' part to say that we ought to love our enemies. It wasn't easy for Joseph, and there's a million other times and places where it's been hard, and it is hard for us right now. And you know what I think as I read through our gospel today and reflected on it, is I don't think Jesus intended for this to be easy for us. You see, humans in general, I think we prefer when everything is fair and balanced, right? Kids, when they're little, they start out with that great thing, everything has to be exactly fair. You know the old trick, you cut, I choose? Now, mind you, we had 3 kids, so that didn't work very well in our family. So early lessons be like fair isn't how families work always. But that didn't keep them from whining, and it went on from there. Like, I never remember when our youngest got his cell phone, like as we're heading towards middle school. And the older two are like, oh my gosh, he has an iPhone. We didn't get iPhones when we were that age. It's not fair. And I'm like, you know what? They didn't have iPhones when you were that age. Get over it. It's not fair. I think kids have been singing that song since way back in Joseph's family when they're like, it's not fair that Dad likes Joseph best and gave him that beautiful coat. We didn't get a nice coat, right? It's just part of how we are wired. So, by the time that we are adults, we expect that to be how our human relationships should and ought to work. We want return on our investments with our human interactions. Like if you don't do this thing for me, then I'm not going to do that thing for you. It's sort of the foundation on which we have built our orderly society. It's like the deal that we expect. And it's then therefore not surprising that we think that love might actually work this way too. Because if you got to have contracts and I'll do this favor if you do that favor, then why shouldn't it be that if you love me, I'll love you? And if you do something good for me, then I'll do something good for you. And if you owe me one, then you know what? Then I'll do one for you. I'll owe you one down the road. And if you're going to repay me, then I'll give you what you need now. But I think Jesus is saying that's not how love works. Matthew Meyer Bolton, who's one of my favorite biblical commentators, says that Jesus is basically saying when you think that love works that way, you're reducing it to a commodity. You're reducing it to something that we can buy and we can sell, we can trade, we can barter, and we can even beg for. But that's not what love is. Love, Jesus says, is something that we have to offer freely, and we have to do it with our whole hearts. And we're not expecting to get something back, right? We are not thinking, I will only love if I know that I'm going to give every ounce of that love back in exactly the way that I put it out there. Matthew Meyer Bolton says it this way: to the extent that fairness depends on such things, true love is not fair. It lives and moves beyond the arena of fairness, and it keeps no accounts. Precisely as a gift and not a payment, true love requires neither spur nor return, neither prior merit nor subsequent compensation. It is completely free. Now, there's a word that we use in the church, a churchy word that comes from the Bible, to talk about this kind of love. It's called grace. It's a confusing word because we use grace in graceful ballerina, but in the Bible, it very specifically talks about this kind of free, unmerited, all-giving love that Jesus is describing here. It's brought up most especially because it's how we describe how God loves us and saves us in Jesus. Paul loves to talk about it. We don't earn that salvation. It's a free gift from God. God forgives us. And here, we meet Jesus challenging us to live and love that way too. If God could do it for us, then, we're all made in the image of God, so we should be able to do that as well. So, the interesting thing, though, about this is that it's the way Jesus pitches it, because he starts out with the words, "for you that listen." It's like he assumes not everybody wants to hear this message. Not everyone is ready to hear this message. But for you that listen, for you that are ready to hear it, love your enemies. Do good to those that hate you, not just those that love you. Bless the ones that curse you. And pray for those that abuse you, not just the ones that are good to you. See, Jesus is kind of saying there's no prizes. for the easy kind of love. Because you know what? Even the worst of the worst, they can do that stuff. It's not easy at all what Jesus is asking of us. And Jesus loves to use hyperbole. He makes it really big, this. But I think the key point that he's trying to make is that this kind of love, this gracious, unmerited kind of love that you even give to the people that you find it hard to love, you can't do it grudgingly. It's hard, next level stuff, and you know what? It's got to be overflowing. I love the image that he uses. I'm not a great baker, but I do know how to measure flour. You got to scoop it up. You got to carefully run the knife across the top and do this, because if it gets too packed down, it'll be off, and if it's too full, it'll be off. It's as if it's saying you can't actually measure love, kind of like you can't actually measure flour, and it, you know what? It just kind of goes everywhere. It wiggles its way into places. Now, the thing I think that's really helpful for all of us is to remember is the context that we got last week. And I'm not sure everybody got to hear me last week, but this is a direct follow-on on last week. It's like last week's reading stopped, this week starts. And last week was, blessed are the poor, woe are the rich, all those things that we consider related to the Beatitudes, though they have a slightly different take in Luke. But the key thing that I think we need to carry forward is the setting, because Jesus gives this sermon in a level place, and people are there from all over the place. His teaching is meant for everyone. But also, at a certain point, he stops and he looks his disciples in the eye. And in Luke's gospel, there's lots and lots of disciples, a huge multitude of disciples. But he's looking at them and he's saying to them, this is for you. If you want to be my follower, my disciple, then this is how you have to learn how to love people. So here we are today. And I think many of us would say that we want to be followers of Jesus, right? Well, loving our enemies has not gotten any easier today than it would have been in Jesus' time when he preached this sermon. And given the world that we live in, how do we do that without capitulating to the manifest injustices and abuses that we see happening around us? Well, Joseph, great role model, right? Because he challenges, he pushes back. But long time ago, I would love some role models for today. And so I sort of cast around, and one of the ones that I came up with was Senator John Lewis. Does everybody know who Senator John Lewis is? Yeah. He grew up black in the segregated South. And as he was a civil rights activist from the time he was quite young, but he was in a lot of actions and protests that were really difficult. He was one of the Freedom Riders, which I don't know if you know the story of that particular action, but the Freedom Riders were beaten repeatedly by violent mobs in every town that they went, and that included police brutality. The leadership of the civil rights movement was going to shut that movement down because it was just so brutal what was happening there, but they decided to carry on because they thought it was super important. Now, Senator John Lewis, we know from words that he said that he credited why he could do what he could do to his understanding of what at the time was being articulated by a lot of leaders, especially in the black church, what was called the beloved community. And in his biography that was written by Raymond Arsenault, you get direct crediting. Like John Lewis says, I learned this from Martin Luther King, who was reading the Gospels, was hearing Jesus say, you have to love your enemies to do this, but you have to do it in these ways. these actions. Peace, you're not going to hurt them, you're not going to hate them, you're not going to harm them. But you know what? You're going to shame them. You're going to challenge them. You're going to challenge the false sense of superiority, because reconciliation and redemption and this beloved community comes through that form of forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, the interesting thing that I remember learning about John Lewis is he didn't just have to face up against all of that brutality that was coming towards them as they tried to desegregate transportation systems and all of that. He also had to battle against and stand up and challenge people in his own camp. He was the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and so he was their representative in the committee that planned the march on Washington. And he was supposed to give a speech, and he wrote his speech, and in his speech he was going to call out President Kennedy's draft of the Civil Rights Bill because it did not address the issue of police brutality. He just sort of steered clear of it. And John Lewis thought, that's not okay. We need to talk about this. And you can see why he would do that. The older generation of civil rights leadership, they tried to rewrite his speech. They didn't want him to talk about it. But John Lewis stuck it out. He gave that speech. Probably, I think he was pretty good at making trouble in the good kind of way, don't you think? Now, we all know he went on to become senator. He served long, all the way through until 2020 when he died. And he wrote a piece for the New York Times, an op-ed that was published immediately after he died. But he wrote it just a few days before he died. And one of the things he said in there is, when historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burden of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. Love that loves one's enemies enough to challenge injustice. I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus modeled it for us, don't you think? He never stopped offering gracious, forgiving love to everyone that he met. And he never stopped challenging and healing injustices wherever Jesus met them. He modeled this for us. So, here we are today. We like to think that loving our enemies has never been more difficult. But guess what? We're just a long line of followers building that beloved community. The question for us is, how are we called to do it today? How are we called to do that here and now? Love with that full, overflowing graciousness that loves all the people in a way that even calls us into challenging the injustices that we see and confronting them. And how do we do that without adding to anger and hatred? Its very impossibleness points to the fact that it is our only path forward. So I'm going to close with you with a poem. It's from Wendell Berry. It's called Enemies. If you are not to become a monster, you must care what they think. If you care what they think, how will you not hate them? And so, become a monster of the opposite kind. From where then is love to come? Love for your enemy. That is the way to liberty. From forgiveness. Forgiven, they go free of you, and you of them. They are not to you as sunlight on a green branch. You must not think of them again except as monsters like yourself, pitiable when unforgiving.